In every grand empire, behind the stone walls and silken curtains, there existed one truth. Kings feared being outshined, even by their own queens, especially by their queens. In a world ruled by ego, love could turn into obsession, and obsession into punishment, but there is one story so disturbing, so perverse, that even history wrote about it in whispers. The story of King Pedro II of Castile, the monarch who turned his marriage bed into a public execution ground. Pedro was born to rule. He was crowned as a young man in the 14th century, during an era where a king's honor was defined not just by military victories but by his control over his women. Known by historians as Pedro the Cruel, he was infamous for executing nobles, flaying enemies, and burning traitors alive, but nothing compared to what he did to his own queen. Her name was Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess of royal blood, married off to Pedro to seal an alliance between Castile and France. She was only 16 when she crossed into Spain, dressed in white lace and carrying the hopes of her nation. Pedro was 22, charismatic, brutal, and already deeply involved with his mistress, Maria de Padilla. The wedding lasted a day, the celebration, a night. Then Pedro abandoned Blanche, for 3 days. He refused to consummate the marriage. Then, in an act that stunned even his most vicious advisors, he ordered Blanche to be escorted to a separate castle, not as a queen, but as a political hostage. What triggered this cruelty? Pedro believed Blanche was involved in court conspiracies, that she, along with her French relatives, would undermine his authority. But more than that, he believed she was too proud, too cold, too independent, and worst of all, she did not beg for his love. So he set out to break her. After months of isolation, Blanche was summoned to court again, but this time, not for reconciliation. She was invited to a private royal banquet, where Pedro appeared. After months of absence, he drank wine, laughed, and ordered musicians to play. Then he stood and said to the crowd, "A queen who refuses her king does not deserve the bed of a king." He turned to Blanche, and then to the horror of those present he ordered 2 male servants to escort her to the royal chamber. They were told to entertain the queen, as she had refused to do for her king. This wasn't a drunken joke, it was a royal decree. The palace fell silent. Blanche, trembling, was taken away. Historical records don't describe what happened in that chamber in graphic detail, but they all agree, the servants did not refuse. They couldn't. Disobedience was punishable by death. Whether Pedro watched, whether he waited outside, whether he entered after, no one dared to speak. But the message was clear. The queen had been defiled. By order of her own husband. Pedro repeated the humiliation multiple times. Sometimes it was new servants, sometimes it was men of different ranks, stable hands, cooks, soldiers. Each time, Blanche was paraded like a disgraced priestess, stripped of her dignity, and returned to her room in silence. Why would a king do this? Because Pedro didn't want to kill her. He wanted to break her spirit, to transform love into fear, and turn a symbol of power into a plaything for the palace. This wasn't about lust. It was about domination, control, sadism. He wanted Blanche to feel powerless in the one space where queens usually reigned, the bed. But Blanche didn't weep. At least, not in front of him. According to secret letters smuggled to France, Blanche began keeping a record, a hidden diary, listing the names of each man forced upon her, the date, the mood, the injuries. This wasn't a journal, it was evidence. Whispers say that one of the servants confessed and begged forgiveness at a monastery, revealing the entire system of sexual coercion Pedro had created. That servant, Banachades, later so did his confessor. By now, foreign courts began murmuring. France demanded Blanche's return. The Pope threatened excommunication. But Pedro laughed. He wrote, "My queen sleeps well, fed by my kingdoms." Eventually, Blanche was moved again, this time to a lonely castle near Medina Sidonia. The humiliations continued. And though Pedro never formally divorced her, he declared Maria de Padilla his true wife in secret. Blanche never returned to court. Years later, Pedro ordered her murdered in her chamber. Some say she was strangled with her own bedsheets. Others say she drank poison, slipped by a paid servant. The truth, lost, but her ghost remained. Long after Pedro's own brutal death, he was stabbed in the face by his own half-brother. Blanche's story lingered in Castilian folklore. Locals whispered about the queen of servants, the woman who was too royal to bow, and too strong to break, even when everything was taken from her. And yet her story was not unique. Because in the shadows of other empires, from the Ottoman harems to the Mughals and Anas, kings found new ways to weaponize sex, not against enemies, but against the women they feared the most, their own wives. In Chapter 2, we'll uncover the psychology behind this behavior and how some queens turned their shame into silent revenge. humiliation can destroy a person, but in the darkest corners of royal history, there are queens who learn to weaponize their disgrace and aim it back at the very men who broke them. Asterisk. One such queen was Empress Wu Zetian of China, a woman who was never meant to rule and who began her life at court, not as an empress, but as a concubine of the emperor's father. Asterisk. She entered the Tang dynasty's Forbidden City as a teenage servant girl, trained in obedience, elegance, and silence. Her job, to pleasure men of power, and vanish, but Wu had other plans. Asterisk. After the emperor died, she should have been banished to a monastery like all other concubines. Instead, she seduced the new emperor, the son of the man she once served, and returned to court. Now as his favorite, asterisk, the nobles were horrified. The court whispered, "She's impure, she's defiled." But Wu used her past to terrify them. She said nothing, she just watched. She collected secrets. She manipulated eunuchs, turned servants into spies, and arranged accidents for her rivals. When the emperor fell ill, Wu took over, not as his wife, but as his shadow ruler. Asterisk. She eventually declared herself Empress of China, the only woman in 3,000 years to ever do so. Her power didn't grow despite her past, it grew because of it. She had survived being used, discarded, and shamed, so no insult could wound her. No courtier could manipulate her. She had already been broken once and learned never to be broken again. Asterisk. But Wu wasn't the only queen who mastered the art of psychological revenge. Asterisk. In the Ottoman Empire, palace records speak of a mysterious queen known as Sefi Sultan, who was once a slave brought in from Albania. She was given as a gift to the young Prince Murad, not for love, but for his pleasure. But Sefi was brilliant. Instead of resisting, she played the role. She became his favorite, bore him children, and learned the inner politics of the harem, a place where women were ranked like livestock and stripped of their identities. Then she struck. When Murad became sultan, Sefi controlled him not with beauty, but with silence. She refused to sleep with him for months. When he asked why, she whispered, asterisk, "A slave obeys, but a queen decides." She had flipped the hierarchy. Murad, obsessed, ordered that no other concubine be allowed to bear him sons. Sefi used her network of eunuchs to dominate the palace. When foreign ambassadors visited, they didn't just meet the sultan, they met her. She sent letters, sealed deals, and even had political enemies assassinated, all from behind a silk curtain. Asterisk. What started as forced submission ended in absolute psychological dominance. Asterisk. There's also the story of Razia Sultana, India's only Muslim queen regnant in the 13th century. She was forced to wear male attire to be accepted as ruler. Her court mocked her. She was called unnatural, unholy, impure, even accused of seducing a slave. So Razia turned their poison into strategy. She elevated that very slave, Jamaluddin Yaqub, to a royal commander, not because she loved him, but because it shattered every rule of caste, religion, and power. Her message was simple. Asterisk. If you reduce me to a woman, I will raise a servant above kings. She used the shame they hurled at her to reverse the hierarchy, forcing nobles to bow to a former slave, and humiliating the very system that tried to strip her of worth. Asterisk. Did it last? No. Razia was later betrayed, defeated, and killed. Asterisk. But her rebellion lived on, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous queen is the one you tried to silence. Asterisk. So what ties all these women together? Asterisk. They weren't just victims. They were chess players trapped in cages, learning to use the bars as weapons. Asterisk. Like Queen Blanche of Castile in Chapter 1. Some were broken. Others, like Wu Zetian, Sefi, and Razia, found clarity in humiliation. They realized that when a king uses sex to dominate, he's not just violating a body, he's exposing his own insecurity. And if a queen survives that, she becomes invincible. Asterisk. It's easy to admire queens with crowns, but history's darkest queens were the ones with no protection, no allies, and no rights, only a memory of how deeply they were wronged, and a plan to never let it happen again. That is the true horror of twisted human nature. You can shame a queen. Asterisk.